A man orders an impostor to leave, prompting Ilya Norman to steadfastly declare her identity. The visual narrative establishes a romantic bond, showing the couple standing intimately close together. Raisin reaches out with an inviting gesture, emphasizing the connection between the two characters. Standing before the church, Ilya Norman formally introduces herself as the Saint of the Spark Kingdom. She explains that a saint possesses special powers to deliver people's wishes to God through prayer. A sharp close-up of her eye reveals the silent intensity and determination behind her gaze. Ilya recalls dying of illness in her past life before being reborn into this world as a simple village girl. She spent every day learning proper etiquette to fulfill the role expected of a noble saint. Duke Norman's family adopted her at the age of 8 the moment they discovered she possessed the saint's power. A voice agrees that it really is the case as Ilya turns away, her figure cast in shadow. 10 years later, Ilya smiles, grateful that she can finally use her power to help people. Tears well up in her eyes as she admits the experience was tough, yet she pushes forward. She overhears cruel gossip calling her pathetic and questioning if someone without Norman blood can be a true saint. While a maid notes her fatigue, Ilya stumbles upon an intimate moment between Sister Mary and Lord Raisin. Raisin confesses he wanted to marry Mary, insisting she should have been the saint as the eldest Norman daughter. Mary agrees, fantasizing that they could be together openly if only she held the title of saint. Ilya interrupts them, causing Raisin to coldly ask why someone like her ended up with the power. Resigned, Ilya realizes the royals and the duke's family will never accept her as the real saint. Forcing a smile, she opens the door to greet the waiting crowd, hiding her inner turmoil. She whispers to herself that she only needs to endure this situation for one more day. A bystander questions the meaning of her cryptic words as the heavy doors swing open. Ilya struggles to keep her focus but is snapped back to reality by the crowd calling out for the Lady Saint. She warmly welcomes the people, including a desperate mother begging for her child to be saved. Ilya comforts the woman, assuring her that God will not abandon the feverish infant. Taking a deep breath, she prays for God to shine His healing light upon the sick child. The baby's fever breaks instantly, and the child falls asleep, leaving the mother in shock and relief. Ilya smiles with genuine joy, truly glad that she was able to help the suffering family. She feels a deep sense of purpose, noting that unlike in her past life, she can now save lives. Reassuring the crowd, she finds genuine happiness in healing those whom even doctors cannot help. The sun sets over the mountains, marking the peaceful end to a long and emotional day. Exhausted but relieved, Ilya sighs that she somehow made it through another day. Ilya walks down the corridor, unaware of the figure looming behind a pillar with malicious intent. Startled by a presence, she turns and sharply asks who is there. Lord Raisin and Mary emerge from the shadows, their expressions twisting into triumphant sneers. Mary brazenly introduces herself as Ilya Norman, the saint of the kingdom, stealing Ilya's identity. The real Ilya is shocked, but Raisin gaslights her, calling her Sister Mary and accusing her of blasphemy. Horrified, Ilya wonders if they orchestrated this entire setup to switch places with her. She defies them, declaring that Mary can copy her appearance but can never fake the saint's power. The depth of the betrayal becomes clear to Ilya, realizing this entire scheme was orchestrated to steal her title. Raisin seals the coup with a damning accusation, shouting that Ilya's power is nothing but a fake. Lord Raisin shouts down Mary's explanation, dismissing the pendant as a mere tool and silencing her defense. Mary wonders if her power is malfunctioning, while Raisin glares at her with intense scrutiny. Raisin officially banishes Mary Norman from the Spark Kingdom for the crimes of falsely claiming to be the saint and blasphemy. Mary buries her face in her hands, seemingly devastated by the shocking decree of eternal exile. To everyone's surprise, she flushes with excitement, realizing that this banishment is actually a stroke of luck. Raisin and the surrounding nobles are left completely baffled by her sudden and unexpected delight. Mary internally celebrates escaping a role that felt like a sweatshop, where she was forced to work from dawn until sunset. She realizes that losing the title of saint grants her the one thing she has craved for so long: absolute freedom. Composing herself, she prepares to address Lord Raisin and the court with a newfound sense of liberation. She smiles brightly and immediately accepts the judgment, stating she understands and will leave right away. Mary bows politely and thanks them for everything, leaving Raisin standing there in confused silence. She excuses herself and walks away briskly, eager to put the stifling atmosphere of the castle behind her. Stepping forward with confidence, she revels in the realization that her life is finally her own to direct. Standing under the open sky, she happily ponders her next destination now that the world is open to her. She hails a passing carriage and requests to be taken north, somewhere near the border. The driver laughs off her resemblance to the saint, claiming the real saint would never leave the capital. Mary reflects on her lack of ties, noting that her foster parents have passed and she is now officially in exile. She decides to head to Slawlen, the neighboring kingdom, ignoring the driver's warning that there is nothing out there. Determined to live for herself, she declares that she wants to see the outside world at least once. As the carriage rolls away, she bids a final, peaceful farewell to her homeland. 1 week later, she arrives in the royal capital of Slawlen, taking in the sights of the foreign city. The streets feel strangely empty until she spots a man harassing a young woman nearby. The thug ignores the woman's protests, intent on dragging her away to have some fun against her will. Mary steps in to heal the injured girl, ignoring the thug's angry demand to mind her own business. The thug turns his aggression toward Mary, deciding he will take her along as well since she interfered. Before the thug can lay a hand on her, a stranger steps in and grabs his arm with a vice-like grip. The newcomer smirks at Mary, telling her she has guts for standing up to such a brute. Crushing the thug's hand, the stranger warns him not to do whatever he pleases within his country. The thug trembles in fear, recognizing the intervener as the Prince of Slawlen. Faced with the threat of the prince drawing his sword, the thug realizes he is outmatched and flees. The savior is revealed to be Aktal, the first prince of the Slawlen kingdom. Aktal identifies Mary as the saint of the Spark Kingdom, deducing her identity because the power she used wasn't magic. Startled by his deduction, Mary trips, but Aktal catches her before she can hit the ground. Her stomach loudly grumbles, prompting Aktal to ask why she is traveling alone in such a state. Chuckling at the situation, he invites her to discuss matters over a meal nearby. He insists she accept the offer as his way of thanking her for protecting one of his citizens. Mary agrees to the invitation, and they walk together through the cobbled streets. They arrive at the imposing Slawlen royal castle, the seat of the prince's power. Sitting down to tea and sandwiches, Mary prepares to explain her situation to the prince. Aktal offers his assistance, and Mary hesitantly accepts, hoping he might be able to help her find her way. Prince Act watches Ilya eat with a warm smile, asking if she enjoys the meal, to which she happily confirms that it is delicious. With a gentle but serious expression, he asks if she would mind telling him exactly what happened to lead her to this situation. Ilya recounts the painful betrayal by her stepsister and fiancé, fearing her story sounds like a lie even though she is telling him everything. To her complete astonishment, he immediately validates her account of the Spark Kingdom's horrible operations, confirming without hesitation that it is true. She blushes in confusion, thinking he must be a strange guy to believe such an implausible story right away. When asked if she has any family to turn to or future plans, Ilya admits in despair that she has absolutely nothing and doesn't know what she will do. The prince closes his eyes in thought and begins to propose a solution given her desperate circumstances. He offers her a place to live and food to eat, encouraging her to stay there for a while so she can recover. Seeing her hesitation, he lowers his gaze and clarifies that he is not making this offer solely for her sake. He reveals his driving desire to save Slawlen's people, who have suffered from poverty and sickness for ages. Although he acknowledges it is unfair to ask while she is in such a vulnerable position, he presses on with his request. Desperate for her aid, he begs her to become his country's saint, promising to grant any wish she has in return. He bows his head deeply in supplication, begging her to please help them. Ilya is left completely shocked and speechless by the sudden and intense request. Elsewhere, a man wonders why Ilya looked refreshed, dismissing her actions as a meaningless show of bravado. He remarks with satisfaction on how surprisingly easy it was to take her place. A woman gloats that she is honestly grateful they are identical in every way except for their eye color, even without being related by blood. She claims this usurpation is how things were always meant to be, perhaps even due to divine guidance. The desperate crowd clamors for the false saint's help, praising her beauty as she prepares to start her performance. The impostor saint greets the cheering crowd with a radiant, calculated smile. A desperate man begs her to save his wife who has been in pain for 3 days, asking the saint to shine her saving light. The suffering woman wakes up healed, causing the man to cry out in joy that the saint has saved her. The crowd erupts in praise for the saint, validating her position in the kingdom. Relieved people weep and thank the saint for being there for them. Narration reveals that the kingdom's finest mages studied the true saint's power and managed to somewhat reproduce it. The result of that research is a magic tool born in the form of a pendant. The man confirms that the healing ability is not the saint's true power but merely an effect granted by the magic tool. With the device completed, their scheme to banish the real Ilya came to fruition. The fake saint spreads her arms and wishes God's blessing upon the people. They decide to report to their father, confident they have nothing left to worry about now that their plan has succeeded. Back in Slon, Ilya and the prince sit in a tense, awkward silence. The prince passionately declares he doesn't care if he has to give her everything, imploring her to become the saint of this country. Ilya is flustered, thinking that a prince really shouldn't offer everything so lightly. She smiles, realizing how much the country means to him, while he sheepishly admits he got carried away. Ilya reflects on her past experience and what it means to be a saint. She admits that being able to save people gave her a sense of purpose and happiness, despite it being really tough. However, she recalls the pain of being banished specifically because of that very position. The prince asserts that it is his duty as the country's representative to ask for her help. He apologizes for being rude by asking for her help so suddenly out of nowhere. Ilya stares at him intensely, silently listening to his plea. Source image. He explains that they have lost so much land and so many of their people. He laments that other nations keep using them in diplomacy and trade. The kingdom of Slawland still hasn't recovered from a defeat 50 years ago. He speaks of the people who continue to believe in the royal family despite these hard times. Despite the hardship, he declares his deep love for this country. He vows to do anything if there is a way to repay his people. Ilya realizes she had no idea the people in the neighboring country were living under such harsh conditions. She stands and resolutely tells His Highness to let her know if there is anything she can do. Declaring herself a saint, she promises to reach out a hand to anyone lost and in need. The prince smiles warmly and thanks her for her willingness to help. They shake hands as she asks him to take good care of her. Their moment is interrupted by a knock at the door. The prince welcomes the visitor, noting the perfect timing, while Ilya hides behind him. A leg steps into the room with a polite, "Excuse me." The visitor remarks that the prince finally made it. A tall, uniformed knight stands confidently in the doorway. Source image. The knight notices Ilya standing behind the prince and freezes in surprise. Source image. He yells her full name, Ilya Norman, in shock. Panicking, he demands to know why the saint of a neighboring country is here and asks the Highness what's going on. The knight, Jean, accuses the prince of kidnapping her, reminding him it is illegal. Jean frantically warns that kidnapping a saint will cause an international incident if things go wrong. Ilya begs the prince to help her out as Jean continues to panic. Ilya clarifies that she is no longer the saint of the Spark Kingdom. She announces that from now on, she will be the saint of the Slawland Kingdom. Jean sighs in relief, understanding the situation now that it has been explained. The prince introduces Jean-Claude, his guard and aide, who apologizes to Ilya for overreacting. Ilya politely introduces herself and asks him to feel free to call her Ilya. Jean stammers, so the prince explains that Jean has always been bad with formal language. Jean asks her not to be formal and says he would be happy if she just called him Jean. Ilya laughs that they are close, and the prince confirms they are childhood friends. Jean reminisces that they have been together since they were little, often forgetting Act is an actual prince. The prince says he would like her opinion too and asks Jean to call her in. He mentions that there is another childhood friend involved. He explains she is really sharp and wants her to be Ilya's support for now. He introduces her as Cheyenne, who works as a maid at the castle. He notes that her face has a little softness to it, describing her doll-like appearance. Cheyenne enters and politely introduces herself to Lady Ilya. The prince asks Ilya to let Cheyenne support her, noting they can relax with her around. Ilya thanks Cheyenne warmly for doing all this for her and looks forward to working with her. Jean asks Act if he is sure, telling him not to push himself too hard, while Ilya vows to repay their kindness. Two men discuss the urgent race against time as they navigate the corridor, noting that the woman accompanying them is still weary from her travels and unfamiliar with the new surroundings. The conversation turns to the gravity of the situation involving His Majesty, with one man reprimanding the other for displaying shyness at such a critical juncture. A desperate query is made regarding whether saints possess the ability to heal illnesses, as the speaker urgently directs attention to a specific person who needs examination. The group processes the heavy revelation that the patient in question is His Majesty, understanding the massive implications of his condition. The explanation reveals that the king's decline began when the queen died from an illness, leaving him bedridden for years in a state of mourning and sickness. The patient is formally identified as the 27th king, Laxt Slalin, who is acknowledged by the young man as his own father. Ilya listens intently as the symptoms are listed, including neurological issues, anxiety, stress, fevers, and constant exhaustion that have kept the king bedridden for 3 years. Overwhelmed by the description of the king's suffering, Ilya expresses her horror while the men are told to stop pressuring her. Tension rises as one man insists that the king's condition mirrors the nation's hope, while the other demands he stop overburdening the saint. The group recounts their desperate and exhaustive search for a cure, having already tried every form of medicine, pharmacy, and magic available. A pained expression crosses the man's face as he questions if his desperate assertions about the king's importance were wrong. A clenched fist trembling in frustration signifies the weight of their helplessness and the dire nature of their request. Ilya interrupts the argument by stepping forward with determination, asking His Highness for permission to try and heal the king. The saint admits honestly that she is unsure if healing is possible, but affirms that her duty prevents her from overlooking those in need. One man turns to act with a triumphant look, validating his persistence in bringing the saint to the castle. A vow is made to repay the debt of this kindness one day, emphasizing the depth of gratitude for her willingness to help. Ilya reassures the prince not to worry and apologizes for dragging him into such a high-stakes situation so suddenly. The group arrives at the heavy double doors of the king's chamber, marking the beginning of the critical confrontation with the illness. Ilya expresses her faith that divine guidance brought her to them, believing that God orchestrated this meeting. Act announces his entry to his father, steeling himself as the group steps into the royal chamber. The sight of His Majesty the King lying in bed reveals a frail and suffering figure, highlighting the severity of his long-term condition. The narration laments the king's current state, contrasting his inability to sit up with his former strength and health. Act introduces Ilya as the saint from the neighboring kingdom of Spark, and the king weakly acknowledges his son's presence. Ilya introduces herself to the king and gently requests permission to examine his condition. A terrifying black haze surrounds the king, shocking Ilya, who has never witnessed such a massive amount of corruption before. Ilya stands frozen in horror, her eyes wide as she comprehends the true, dark nature of the king's affliction. The prince notices Ilya's distress and urgently asks if there is anything they can do to assist her. Ilya regains her composure and instructs them to leave the matter to her, signaling the start of the purification process. She explains that a saint's power works by gathering people's prayers and carrying them to God, urging them to pray strongly with her to create a miracle. Ilya clasps her hands in intense prayer, calling out to the Lord to initiate the divine intervention. The room is filled with the intensity of their collective wish as Ilya implores the heavens to hear their voices. Dark, black haze begins to pour out of His Majesty's body, causing alarm and confusion among the onlookers. The observers note that the root of the corruption runs incredibly deep, highlighting the severity of the spiritual affliction. Jean and Cheyenne watch in suspense alongside His Highness, witnessing the supernatural battle for the king's life. A blinding light erupts from Ilya as she prays, her power directly confronting the darkness emanating from the king. The dark haze is visibly sucked into the light as Ilya declares she is not alone, drawing strength from the prayers of those around her. The corruption is successfully expelled from the king's body, leaving him cleansed and surrounded by a gentle, restorative glow. The king sits up, shocking Act, who rushes to ask how his father is feeling after the sudden transformation. The king marvels at the sensation of light and warmth returning to his body, noting that he was struggling to breathe just moments ago. Overwhelmed with relief, the prince embraces his father, expressing his profound joy at the recovery. Act vows that he will never forget this miraculous moment and the aid that saved his father. He turns his gaze toward Ilya, his face flushed with gratitude and admiration for the miracle she performed. Ilya humbly deflects the credit, insisting that it was everyone's combined wishes, not her prayer alone, that brought about the miracle. The onlookers gaze at her with awe and respect, fully acknowledging her identity as a true saint. Act looks at Ilya with a soft, affectionate expression, confirming in his heart that she is indeed special. In Chapter 3, the scene shifts to the king sitting in a wheelchair in the garden, with Act pushing him and insisting on helping. Although the king has recovered from his illness, his physical strength and legs remain weak from years of being bedridden. Prince Aktal has voluntarily taken on the role of providing personal care for his father during his rehabilitation. One of the knights teases Act for looking so happy, to which Act responds that he has every reason to be joyful given the circumstances. Ilya watches the interaction with a smile, thinking that the royal group truly feels like a family, and thanks the knight. The knight expresses his heartfelt gratitude to Ilya, stating that thanks to her, he can finally envision a future for their country. He questions the mechanics of the miracle, recalling her explanation that her power simply carries people's prayers to God. The knight ponders this explanation, seemingly surprised by the simplicity of how the divine intervention functioned. He cheerfully concludes that at this point he would attribute the entire series of events to fate. Ilya insists that her coming to Slalin was the real miracle, but hesitates as she considers the concept of fate. A contemplative expression crosses Ilya's face as she repeats the word fate, realizing the deeper connections at play. The prince interrupts to apologize, feeling guilty that they are selfishly celebrating while ignoring what Ilya has been through. Ilya is surprised by his sudden apology, holding her hand to her mouth in a moment of realization. The prince insists his apology is necessary, but Ilya tries to wave it off, leading to a flustered exchange between them. Ilya reflects on the circular nature of their bond, noting that His Highness saved her when she was in danger, and now he needed a miracle in return. As Act smiles at his father, Ilya thinks that perhaps being able to bring about that miracle really was a stroke of fate. Ilya feels a profound sense of happiness seeing the king and highness together, unable to imagine a better twist of fate than this. The prince beams a bright smile at Ilya and thanks her, leaving her blushing and speechless. The scene pans out to a wide view of the castle against the landscape, as someone remarks on forgetting how high the autumn sky is. The king realizes with a heavy heart that 3 years have passed, marking this as the first autumn he has seen in a long time. He acknowledges that Act has been sweating and laboring for the country in his place for those 3 lost years. Act asks his father not to apologize, but the king insists on expressing his regret for the burden placed on his son. Act praises his father's resilience, stating that he survived an illness that no ordinary person could have withstood. The king looks at his son with pride and gratitude, telling Act that he has become a great man. He continues his praise, declaring Act to be a king that any of them can look up to. Gripping Act's hand firmly, the king announces that he feels he can entrust everything to his son now. In a shocking declaration, the king tells Act that he is passing the crown to him. Act is struck speechless, his eyes widening in total shock at his father's sudden decision. Act protests, arguing that the king just recovered and should have a fresh start, but the king insists he can support Act instead. The king grimly admits that even with recovery, he will never physically be what he once was, despite the illness being cured. Act desperately counters that to the people, the king's strength is their only hope. The king reflects on his mortality and limitations, suggesting he likely doesn't have much time left to lead. Turning the tables, the king asks Act if he wasn't actually the real hope the people clung to while holding the country up these past few years. He challenges Act's perception, asking if he is sure that the king, being the symbol of hope, is still the truth. The king commands his son to hold his head high, addressing him as Aktal Slalin, the 28th king of Slalin, affirming his new role. Jean and Cheyenne stand resolute before the king, confirming their readiness with a single, decisive word. The duo declares their absolute conviction that Lord Act is the only one fit to take the crown. Act kneels in solemn duty, humbly accepting the weight of the throne from his father. The king implores Saint Ilias to lend her support to the new ruler as he steps aside. Hands clasped tightly in a silent, powerful pact of trust and transfer of power. Ilias blushes but responds with a firm and committed affirmation of her new role. The crowd buzzes with anticipation, speculating wildly about the magnitude of the king's impending announcement. A massive gathering swells beneath the Slalin royal castle, waiting in breathless suspense. Citizens whisper anxiously about the king's long illness, fearing the worst as they wait. Trumpets blast through the air, signaling the arrival of the monarchy with piercing clarity. The king steps onto the balcony, thanking his people for gathering to witness this historic moment. A wave of shock and relief sweeps through the crowd as they realize their monarch is standing strong. The king waves to the cheering masses, appearing far healthier than the rumors suggested. Ilias and Cheyenne watch from the shadows, observing the spectacle unfolding on the balcony. Hidden from the crowd's view, the king's hand grips the railing, his knuckles white with strain. Cheyenne reveals that the king's apparent strength is solely due to grueling training sessions with Lord Act. The king projects a booming voice, declaring to the people that he has finally recovered from his illness. In a stunning twist, he immediately announces his abdication, effective from that very day. He confesses that while the illness is gone, his strength is depleted, making the throne too heavy a burden. The crowd gasps in collective disbelief, their joy turning to sudden confusion and worry. The king reassures them by revealing that someone else has been secretly supporting the country in his stead. With a powerful shout, he proclaims his son as the 28th king, King Aktal Slawlen. Act steps forward, acknowledging the suddenness of the transition and urging the people not to be afraid. The crowd erupts into thunderous applause, embracing Prince Aktal as their new sovereign. Act turns back to his father with a smile, receiving a nod that confirms the people's answer. The king affirms that the roar of the crowd proves Act has already earned the nation's trust and true worth. Act seizes the moment to introduce Ilias, declaring that God has not abandoned their nation. He thanks the citizens for their endurance, acknowledging the suffering they have borne for the kingdom. He recognizes that many were pushed to the brink of leaving, making their loyalty even more precious. Act clenches his fist, lamenting his past weakness and his desperate wish for the strength to save them. He presents her to the masses, shouting her name as Saint Ilias to the stunned onlookers. Ilias stands before the uproar, realizing the immense weight of the expectation placed upon her. Murmurs ripple through the crowd as they recognize her as the legendary saint from the Spark Kingdom. Act interrupts the confusion, explaining he cannot reveal everything yet due to her own circumstances. He stakes his personal honor on her identity, vouching that she is undeniably the true Saint Ilias. Act reveals that she came in response to his desperate wish to save Slawlen from its plight. Ilias steps forward, her voice ringing clear as she pledges to serve the country as its saint from this day on. She humbly addresses the crowd, validating their doubts while reasserting her name and presence. She asks only for time, promising to pray for them until they can judge her by her actions. Ilias vows to do everything in her power to become worthy of their welcome and trust. A moment of silence hangs in the air before the first clap breaks the tension. The people's hesitation dissolves into celebration, deciding to trust the saint simply because Prince Aktal does. Act turns to Ilias with a relieved smile, telling her that he is counting on her support. Ilias marvels at how Act's words alone were enough to turn the entire crowd's suspicion into hope. The balcony is engulfed in cheers as the new era of king and saint begins. Ilias silently dedicates herself to the people, resolving to offer her prayers for their future. Memories flood back of being driven from her homeland solely because she bore the title of saint. She recalls her exhaustion, admitting she truly thought she was finished with the burden of sanctity. A smile graces her lips as she accepts that no matter where she runs, her destiny is to be a saint. Reinvigorated, Ilias declares herself overflowing with motivation to serve her new home. Inside the castle, Act apologizes for the cramped conditions compared to the grandeur of the Spark Kingdom. He offers her the freedom to use the facility however she sees fit. Ilias insists the modest space is perfect for her, distinct from the oppressive great cathedral of her past. Act credits Cheyenne for maintaining the space, explaining it is always managed with care. Ilias notes the pristine condition, believing God would be pleased with such a well-cared-for sanctuary. She instinctively calls him Majesty, but Act laughs and insists she simply call him Act. A realization strikes Ilias as she processes his request for informality. Act explains that everyone close to him uses his name, inviting her into his inner circle. He smiles warmly, predicting that the two of them are destined to be friends for a long time. Ilias beams back, accepting the friendship and welcoming him into her new life in his country. Act extends his hand in gratitude, solidifying their new partnership. They clasp hands in the empty hall, looking forward to the work they will accomplish together. The next morning brings a shock as Ilias finds the church completely empty with no visitors. Determined not to wait, she decides to step outside despite Cheyenne's warning not to overdo it. Ilias greets the people outside with a bright smile, inviting anyone to come in and talk. The citizens recoil in shy hesitation, feeling unworthy to trouble a saint with their personal issues. Ilias wonders if the people of Slawlen are simply unaccustomed to leaning on others for support. She resolves to go to them instead, asking Cheyenne to accompany her into the town. She wants to see their lives and hear their problems firsthand, refusing to stay isolated. The crowd reveals that many frail people cannot make the trip to the castle, and they would be thrilled by a visit. A woman eagerly offers to guide her, and Ilias embraces her role as the proactive saint of Slawlen. She rejects the passive role of waiting in a church, determined to forge a new path. Looking out over the city, she prays for many good encounters as she begins her journey among the people.